All right. Hello and welcome to Social Cognition, the first installment where we talk about the history of social cognition as part of psychology and some basic concepts. So basically what we want to talk about is what is social cognition even? Social cognition refers to trying to make sense of our social environment. So basically constructing a social reality. This means we can ask what determines how we think and feel about our social environment. So that means about other people that we meet, friends, strangers, groups that we belong to. And we can also ask how do we form impressions about these other people? How does interacting with them make us feel? And how does interacting with them change our own behavior? So we could also say what affects our social behavior. And that is the idea behind social cognition. The idea is to ask, how do people make sense of their social environments? And in trying to understand how people make sense of their social environment, we can consult three facets. The situation, so asking what is going on and who's involved in the specific case that we're looking at, that we're trying to construct a reality about. We can ask about the person who processes information about their social environment. So who is the person that does this processing? What kind of a person is that? What specific traits do they have? And what kind of preferences do they have? And then this may affect how they think about their social reality. And we have to think about general cognitive processes and also affective processes that affect many people, the average person. So some basic psychological functioning may also influence how we construct reality. Now let's take a look at this in an example. Let's say I need to buy bread, and because we are trying to keep a lot of distance between ourselves and others, when I go to the supermarket to prevent the spread of COVID-19, I will also try to do that. So what's going on is I'm going to buy bread and I'm going to the supermarket. So who's involved? We're still on the situation side. Well, there also are other shoppers. Now, the situation is I am trying to keep distance. And now there could be several types of situations going on. There might be a situation where that's really easy to do, the keeping distance bit, because, for instance, at the cashier, at the cash desk, there might be on the ground markings that tell me how far to stay away from the other people. So we're saying 2 meters, right? And they might just have marked that on the ground. And that would make it easy for me to keep my 2 meters distance from other shoppers. But if I'm not yet at the cash desk, but I am standing in the bread aisle and another customer is also standing there, I have to assess myself how far 2 meters are. So here might be a difference in the situation. The situation could either be it's easy to tell how far 2 meters are, or it could be it's hard to tell how far 2 meters are. Now, let's take the it's hard to tell part and focus on giving an example how a person, individual specific factors might influence how I construct my social reality. So as a person, I might be risk averse. And if I see someone else in the bread aisle, I think, okay, I want to rather keep more distance than too little because I don't want to risk contracting or spreading the virus. But if I'm a person who is less risk averse, I might worry less about the distance that I keep, and I might, in the end, keep less of a distance. So the idea here is that whether I am risk averse or not, which is a personal preference, so an inter-individual, it's a difference between individuals. This might influence how I construe the social reality, whether it's necessary to keep more or less distance, and then consequently also my behavior. Now, those are examples for situation and person that we've now covered. And now let's take a look at what's going on underneath all of that. What are basic cognitive processes and also affective processes that might be going on? So you could say, well, we are living in a time of a pandemic. Probably many people are afraid. And the fact that they are afraid might color how they think about the social interaction. So going to the supermarket in the first place might be something that we currently perceive as rather risky. um, and everyone is in a state of some heightened vigilance. And it is not a supermarket visit that is just the ordinary from pre-pandemic times, but within this pandemic, our heightened vigilance might lead us to construe differently what the social reality of visiting a supermarket is. This would be an affective example. And in terms of cognitive processes, so in terms of thinking, well, I have to first identify the need to go to the supermarket. So think about what I need and whether I have it and how I can procure it. And while I'm in the supermarket, I will have to do some mental calculations. Which bread do I think is worth it, and so on. And how much does it cost? Do I have the money to pay for it? So, and I might have some memory functions going on in between. So I have to assess what do I remember, how much money is in my bank account. I hope it's enough to cover some bread. Yeah, so this is the idea of cognitive processes and affective processes, and this might be this refers to things that are going on in the average person, in like everyone. Everyone has some type of memory going on. Everyone has some type of information processing going on. When we look for where is the bread even in the supermarket, this also is part of social reality. So to summarize, constructing social reality means consulting influences both from the situation and the person involved specifically, and from the underlying cognitive and affective processes. And then if you take all of that together, what comes out of it is the social reality that we construe. Now, I've given you an example, but what I'd like you to do now is come up with your own example. Think about where, when, and how you have to make sense of your social environment. And yeah, just pause the video, take a minute to think about it. What is a situation where you have to make sense of what's going on in your social environment? And really, this could be anything. This could be you reaching out to your friends via Zoom or Facebook, or talking to your parents on the phone. Really take a second to think about a situation where you have to now make sense of your social environment. And then also think about which personal influences then affect your specific sense making. How are you perhaps different from another person, from, let's say, another friend? And how would the two of you make different assessments, different sense of your social environment? All right, pause this video now and then come back here once you've thought about this task. Okay, welcome back. And let's now talk a little bit about what social cognition entails in terms of the research side of things. So social cognition is the combination of two ideas, basically. On the one hand, phenomenology. So a systematic description of how people say they experience themselves and their social environments, and themselves in their social environments. So on the one hand, social cognition is about finding out kind of the lay theories that we all have about our everyday interactions. So what do you think about, basically like the exercise we just did, what do you think about how you have to make sense of your social environment? What kind of a lay theory or an everyday psychology do you have? And what are also we could also subsume mental models in this. So this is one facet of social cognition. And the other facet is cognitive psychology, which studies differences and modes of thinking, learning, and memorizing, and other basic cognitive functioning. So from that perspective, we have models of information processing and models of information retention. So basically information, or like theories and evidence about how people deal with information, how people process information. And then if we take those two together, we arrive at questions of social cognition. So at the, let's go back real quick, at the one side, we take a little bit of phenomenology and we take a little bit of social cognition, and then we mix it together, and then we get social cognition. And we get questions or research questions such as, how is social information encoded, stored, and retrieved from memory? We could also, in cognitive psychology, also ask this more generally, not specifically about social information, but social cognition is about memory as it pertains to social information. We can also ask, how is specifically social knowledge structured and represented? And another facet of social cognition is asking, how are social judgments and decisions made? Okay, so those are some of the most important questions in social cognition research. And now this is the research part of it, but is there also an applied side of social cognition? The answer is yes. Social cognition has many leaks into real life. So it's not just basic research, but it's also applied research. Or it can be applied to real life problems. Here are some examples. For instance, social cognition research can be applied to marketing, where it comes to promoting products and services, and we can leverage knowledge that we have about how social reality is understood to help people pick products to buy. Social cognition research is also really important for public policy and public health, so it can help us organize society more effectively. Social cognition research has implications for management, that means for providing conditions in which people can work productively and fairly. Social cognition also has implications for public relations, for instance, by engaging public opinion and getting people to voice their opinions. Journalism taps into social cognition research, asking how to communicate information effectively, because the receivers of this information are social beings. NGOs can make use of social cognition research in mobilizing supporters and administering their services effectively. And more generally, social cognition is really interesting for life because it can help you understand yourself and others in their social contexts. Now, let's take a look at the roots of social cognition. Let's take a little bit of a browse through history as it affects social cognition, and at some theories surrounding the basis of social cognition research. Now, I want to start with the idea of the rational decision maker that you might know from economic psychology already, or from economics, the Homo economicus. The idea here is that no matter if you are in a social or a not social context environment, decision makers would make choices in a rational way, in a way that maximizes their own utility, so that maximizes what they can get out of the situation that they're making a decision about, and that they make decisions in an objective way. That means they're free from emotions that taint their decisions, or like that make them decide for this rather than that just because of their emotions. And the idea is also that these rational decision makers would be logical, so that they would be free from cognitive processing errors. They wouldn't make mistakes, would not make mistakes, for instance, in calculating the price of bread. Or they would also be free from cognitive biases. And now this idea is based on the expected utility theorem that's from Neumann and Morgenstern, and you can compare it to the idea of a lay scientist, as Fisk and Taylor, you will find this in our readings, have put it down. So this would be the idea of a rational decision maker. And this is, so a rational decision maker would make perfectly rational choices also in social settings, right? So even when it's about a social question in a social environment, a rational decision maker wouldn't make a bad choice or a non-rational choice. But we can ask ourselves if our behavior is indeed always rational. And now this is an example from the rather not so social environment, but we will quickly discover that it's also got some social aspects in it. So if we take a look at whether our behavior is rational, for instance, we can take a look at why people die. What are the reasons that people die? And here's some data from the Center of Disease Control. I think that's from 2002. And here this is reports that 50% of deaths in the US between the ages of 15 and 64 are the result of bad personal decisions, such as smoking, lacking exercise, criminality, drug or alcohol use, and risky sexual behavior. So this would suggest that even though we know some things are just bad decisions, rationally speaking, we still sometimes do it. So even though, for instance, let's take smoking, we know relatively well that smoking is a behavior that leads to negative health outcomes. Still, people smoke. So there's a mismatch between the claim that people can actually rationally assess a situation and then make the rationally optimal choice. So smoking clearly in this case is not a rational choice, yet people still do it. So here is another example of questioning whether a behavior is always strictly rational in the sense of the Homo economicus. Here, this example is a classic study from social cognition run by Ash in the 1950s. And it goes like this. So participants are shown a reference line, which you can see on the left side, and then are asked to indicate, compared to which of the other lines, A, B, or C, fit this line the best. So which line is the equivalent? And you can clearly see that the reference line is as long as line C in this example. And the interesting bit about this, though, is that in this experiment, when asked to indicate which line A, B, or C is closest in length to the reference picture, there were two conditions. One, a control condition, where participants, just like I just did that, they just on their own, without any social pressure, answered this question. And then there was also an experimental condition, where participants weren't alone while they answered this question. And instead, there were 7 confederates or actors who were instructed to do something specific. And participants in both conditions, the control and the experimental condition, they saw 18 trials. So 18 of these lines that they were supposed to match with the reference group. And now here's the interesting bit about the confederate behavior. So in the first 2 trials, all the actors gave the correct answer. In the third trial, all the actors gave the same wrong answer. And then in the remaining 15 trials, 11 times the actors also gave the same wrong answer, or the remaining, that should be 4, not 3, trials, there was again some correct answers from the actors. And now we can ask, how does the behavior of the confederates influence how many correct identifications of line length participants gave? So you can take a minute here to form an expectation. And our expectation for the control group, I think, would be that people are nearly perfect in solving this task. It's a really simple task after all. And this is also what we see. So if we look at the data in the control condition, we have almost 100% correct responses. In the experimental condition, where confederates were present, you can see that we are far below these 100% correct answers. So we have, let's say, around 60% correct answers only in these experimental conditions. So what we can see is that our participants adapted their behavior to the behavior that they saw in the group, the behavior that the confederates modeled for them, basically. And yeah, that's what we would then call conformity. And clearly, we would say, in the sense of the Homo economicus, this is not really rational behavior. If people know, and that's what the control condition suggests they do know, that which lines are indeed of the same length, they really shouldn't change their behavior just because other people give the wrong answer, right? If they were rational decision makers. But still, we do see this type of conformity. If we look at the data in a little more detail, we can see that this is the data from the experimental condition taken apart. There were some participants who just never gave the right answer in the presence of the confederates who gave wrong answers. There were some people who sometimes followed the Confederates, so it might be when they were a little bit less certain, then they would rather follow the opinion of the Confederates. And there were people who never followed the example of the Confederates, and they always just gave the right answer. They were never wrong. And they consistently would defy, so to say, the social pressure that came from the Confederates. So one of the basic findings from this ASH study is that people do adapt their behavior and sometimes even their attitude to the behavior that is modeled by a group. But there's more than conformity going on here. Actually, the study is really interesting also because there was a debriefing and a post hoc interview. So participants, the actual participants, not the Confederates, were asked what they thought about this experiment. And some participants said that they didn't want to look silly or be rejected by the rest of the group. And you could say that this is basically normative social influence. So this would mean using others as a reference for what should be done. And then if you look at it through that lens, well, this is kind of a type of rational behavior again, even though it doesn't lead to the factually correct response. Maybe there's something else here that people are trying to optimize, which is how to normatively fit into their group. Other participants in this post hoc interview said that they thought the others must have had better eyesight or have been better informed. And that's kind of true, right? Because the actors were instructed to give wrong answers. So they thought, or we could think about this as informational social influence, using others as a source of information. And some participants also said that the others, the Confederates, were correct, even if they weren't, and that their own answers were correct. So we might even see something like a distortion of perception, a really change of belief that might have occurred in this experiment. Yeah. So basically, this goes to show that the behavior that people display is not necessarily always the one that we would expect if we looked at behavior through a lens of rationality, through the lens of the Homo economicus, if you will. And this is also a perspective that behaviorism took on. So they basically said, well, what we are interested in social cognition is trying to understand how people think, but it's difficult to see how people think because we can't really observe cognitions well. In the ASH example, I told you that there was an interview, but it's really difficult for us to observe thinking. We don't have a smart technology that allows us to read out the contents of people's brains as they think specifically about the line comparison task, for instance. And that's why this methodological behaviorism that questioned whether it is possible to measure cognitions said, okay, right, it seems like we can't do this well, so let's better not do it, and instead only study behavior, hence the term behaviorism, and reduce behavior to a stimulus-response setup. So just look at what's going into the system, what comes out, what's the behavior that comes out in the end, and the cognition that may or may not be going on in the middle, we don't worry about that. And here we also have a big focus on reinforcement learning. Taking this suggestion that it's difficult to measure cognition even a step further, we have a more radical form of behaviorism as supported by Skinner, asking if cognitions are even the cause of behavior. So this more radical form of behaviorism would say, well, there's not really necessarily any evidence on the causal direction of the link between cognition and behavior. It could also be that cognitions are just a post hoc rationalization of behavior. So because I do X, I have to somehow make myself feel good about it, and then I think in a way that makes it appear to me that it made sense to choose X or to do X. So this rational behaviorism completely rejected the idea that cognitions necessarily are the cause of behavior and suggested that there might be not just a monodirectional link, but a bidirectional link might be at least there. So this was basically a dark chapter for cognition research, where cognition was just, not central for research, and it remained in the black box. And only behavior was interesting. But then came the cognitive revolution. And here I have a quote from Berner in 1990 that helps us understand how cognition came back on the table. And the idea here is that cognition became interesting again because people were interested in meaning, how people make sense of the world and how they establish meaning. So if we look at this quote, it goes, there was an all-out effort to establish meaning as a central concept of psychology during this cognitive revolution. Its aim was to discover and to determine formally the meanings that human beings created out of their encounters with the world, and then to propose hypotheses about what meaning-making processes were implicated. So in this cognitive revolution, meaning moved back into the focus of research. And in particular, this could occur because some methodological problems could be overcome. So the idea was to experimentally manipulate the environment, observe changes in behavior, and from these manipulations leading to specific changes in behavior, infer mental states. So the Ash experiment, for instance, might fit in the in this literature. Okay, here's another example for a study that fits into bringing meaning back into psychology from the cognitive revolution, basically. So this experiment deals with cognitive dissonance, and I'll just explain in a second what this is. And it's an experiment by Festinger and Carr-Smith in 1959. Here's how it goes. Participants were asked to participate in this like a super boring task, really very boring. And after completing this task, they were randomly allocated to one of three groups. Either they were in the control group and then they didn't have anything specific to do, or they were in an experimental group where they were asked to tell the next participant that the experiment was actually interesting. So they were asked to lie. And for this lie, they would receive $1. And then there was a third condition where these participants from the boring task were asked to tell the next participant again that the experiment was actually interesting. So they were again asked to lie, but they would receive 20 euros for their lie. And then, so participants from all three conditions were in the last stage in an interview. Let's take a look at the results. And here, these are the results from the interview. Because participants were asked to rate how much they enjoyed the task. Do you remember the super boring task from the beginning? On a scale of -5 to +5. And now we can see the data split up by experimental conditions. So we have the control condition on the left, the condition where participants had to lie and earn $1 in the middle, and then where they would lie and earn $20 on the right. And in the first row, you can see how enjoyable they thought the task was, or they reported the task was. And the control condition, rather not so enjoyable. And the same goes for the $20 condition. But in the $1 condition, people were actually positive about how enjoyable they found the task. How much they learned from the task. On a scale from 0 to 10, you can see people generally thought they didn't learn a lot. And this was rather a bit lower in the $1 condition, but that's not a huge difference here. And the next question was whether they thought that the task was scientifically important, again, rated from 0 to 10. And here you can see again, that the control and $20 condition are kind of similar, but the $1 condition peaks up. Well, actually, even the $20 condition is a little bit lower than in the control condition, right? And lastly, the question for the interview was whether they would participate in a similar experiment again, rated from -5 to +5. And again, you can see control and $20 condition are kind of similar. Maybe even the $20 condition is a little bit of a lower rating, but the $1 condition participants were kind of positive about wanting to participate again. So overall, we would say the control condition and the $20 condition look sort of alike, but the $1 condition seems to be a bit different. So why would we see this pattern of results? Take a second to pause the video here and think about what you think why we see this pattern of results. Okay, let's see if your conjectures are right. Let's see why we think we see this pattern of results. Well, we would say individuals have a self-concept. So we like to think about ourselves as specific people. Maybe I like to think of myself as a pro-social person, a caring and nurturing person, and a very honest person. But sometimes behavior that I show in a specific situation might not fit that self-concept well. So maybe I was not nice, perhaps even not violent, I wouldn't do that, but not nice, let's stick with that, to another person in a specific situation. Or in this experiment, maybe I lied to another participant and I told them that a super boring task was actually interesting. And that doesn't fit well with my self-concept. So my self-concept and my situation-specific behavior might be in conflict. Now, if I get paid a lot of money to lie in the specific situation, I can resolve this conflict. Well, because I just did that for the money. It's not actually a threat to my self-concept. I'm still an honest person and I would usually never lie. But in this case, I did because of the money. So this would be a way to resolve this conflict, this cognitive dissonance. Oh, sorry, I should have said that here. This conflict, we can call it cognitive dissonance. And being paid a lot of money for lying, this might be a way for me to resolve this cognitive dissonance. But if I only get paid peanuts, just $1, and I still lied, I actually must have liked the experiment because I wouldn't lie for so little money, right? So changing my cognitions to reconcile the situation-specific behavior with my individual self-concept to get rid of my cognitive dissonance. This adaptation of my cognitions, that is the interesting bit. That is why participants in our experiment change their opinion. So that is why we would observe this pattern of results. That's in the $20 condition, I can feel okay about lying because I just did it for the money. In the $1 condition, I have to change how I feel about the task and actually report that I feel better about it and feel better about it because I can't just attribute away my lying, because it was so little money and I wouldn't just lie for so little money. In other words, this cognitive revolution has brought to our attention that, first of all, cognition seems to be a thing, and at least it's interesting to study it. And on the other hand, it might not be strictly rational in the original sense of the meaning, the way that we think. But there's some logic to it. So the way people think has a systematic thing to it. It's not random. And indeed, there might be some shortcut ways of thinking that we use. One facet or one line of theory is trying to explain these shortcuts is the idea of consistency maximization, that we try to achieve coherence between conflicting beliefs and attitudes, such as in the cognitive dissonance theory by Festinger, where I just explained the experiment to you. Another way of thinking about shortcut ways of thinking is employing the bounded rationality view. So saying that people operate in a quasi-rational way, so it's not rational in the original sense of the meaning of the word, but it means that within the bounds of our limited cognitive capacities, we still do something that makes sense. It's quasi-rational. And here we have, as examples, bounded rationality theory, and also the idea of the cognitive miser, as defined in Fisk and Taylor. So the idea that sometimes we're just cognitively a little bit lazy and we try to make the most out of using limited resources. Yeah, that would be the bounded rationality view. And then there's also the strategic sophistication perspective that suggests that we can flexibly adapt our strategies of thinking to changing situational demands. That would be the motivated tactician view as defined by Fisk and Taylor. So suggesting that we adapt how we think and how we apply our cognitive resources depending on what the situation is like. And this also fits to the idea of strategic sophistication in economics. So in a way, you could say that research in social cognition is kind of rediscovering the idea of rationality. So we clearly depart from the idea that there are no emotions and there are no irrational cognitive mistakes that we make, and people do make errors. But it's not all errors, but there are actually, there are ways of thinking, shortcut ways of thinking that still work some of the time, but that are clearly systematic. So even when people depart from the classically rational outcomes, the way that they get there is not through randomness and mayhem, but it is through a specific route. And this route we can describe, we can study, and we can try to understand. So that is our overview of where social cognition research even came from. What we've discussed is the idea that social cognition means looking at how people make sense of their social environments. And we've taken a look at two seminal experiments in the social cognition literature, the Asch conformity experiment and the Festinger cognitive dissonance experiments. And we've seen that social cognition, we should try to understand it as like a facet of research in front of a background of questioning rationality and decision making, also in social decision making. Realizing that perhaps cognition is really difficult to study, and we discussed behavioralism as really questioning whether cognition is even that central. But then the cognitive turn or the cognitive revolution bringing about again interest in cognition, and the discovery that there is a systematic there's a systematic sense to how people think, even if it is not rational. That is what we study now, the way that people think in social contexts. All right, this is it for this installment. I'll see you in the next video.